I'm so glad everybody's here and had a chance to come. I think you're really going to enjoy today. I'm excited about having the book signing and being here, and I'm really excited about meeting so many people that I have heard the names but have not seen the faces, and that's really great. I do want to let everyone know that we do have the books available. If you want to get some extra, feel free. They make great gifts, that kind of thing. And they are $10 each today, and we can go ahead and get those signed afterwards. Also, just following the program, we're going to have a short time for questions and answers. If you think of a question, have a question, or think of one while Brian is speaking, then feel free to ask it at that time. It is such a privilege to announce, to introduce Brian, especially because he's my husband, but also because he is such a wonderful writer and a wonderful storyteller. Whenever Brian started working on the book, he began working on it right after retirement, when he started his retirement. And as he began working on the book and reading the stories over and over again, listening to the stories and him reading the stories to me, it is so different. Me hearing the stories in his perspective and the way he does them. And I know so many of you have heard him tell stories and know that it is such a different thing, and it's wonderful to hear them that way. But it is also wonderful to hear what other people think about those stories and their perspectives on them. And it is the mark of a great storyteller to be able to engage your reader and have the reader feel like they are a part of what's going on. And one thing that I hear so much from people is that whenever they read the stories, when they're finished with the stories or as they go through them, they're able to think about memories and things in their childhood, in their past. And it is so comforting to them to read the stories, even if they don't know the people that are in there as well as many of you all do. But it is very nice to hear what other people think about it and feel about it. We'll go ahead and let him come up. I am just excited to have him be able to speak today and for y'all to hear some of him saying the stories, reading the stories, and hearing them. But the author of Reflections in Time, Brian Ferris.
Well, I thought we would start off by letting you know how the book came about. My boys, my son Scott, who is here now, he's our oldest, and their whole life, I told them stories of our growing up time, times we had at Royal Webb, all the things that happened to our family. And throughout the whole time, they were saying, "Dad, you need to write a book. You need to write a book." And I'd slunk it off. I thought, that's the last thing in this world I want to do, is sit down and write a book. And it just kept on and on. Well, Marla said, "Yeah, you need to write a book." Well, when Marla talks, Brian listens. Well, she said, "If you will start a blog, I'll set it up for you." And I said, "Well, if you'll do that, I'll sit down and start writing." And she set up a blog, and many of you have seen the blog. And I just began to write. I think about something that happened in my early years. I would think about something that happened at the old house on Cove Road where Grandma lived years and years ago. I don't remember the things that happened when they lived on the Royal Webb Road, because that's where I was born. I don't remember the things that happened in the holler, because that was way before my time. But I heard Daddy tell stories, and I heard Grandpa tell stories. And I think about things that would happen at Royal Webb School. And going down to Floyd Holder's store and trying to hitch a ride to Jacksonville to a football game. because we didn't have any transportation. We didn't have any way of going. And if it hadn't been for Jim and John Green, I wouldn't have been able to go anywhere. But I think about those. I mean, seriously, I'd lay in bed at night and I'd think about something, and I would begin to think about that and develop it, and it would develop into a story. And the next morning I'd sit down and I'd start writing. And that happened over a period of a couple of years. And all at once, one morning I woke up and there was like 30-something stories in the blog. And we were getting anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 hits every time I'd write a story. There were, at last count we had, there were people reading and logging on to the blog from 12 different foreign countries. And I just went from there. Marla told me, she said, you know, you need to publish this. And I said, honey, I can't do that. I mean, I'm not a writer. I'm just an old country boy from up on the Royal Web Road. And she said, you need to publish this. So we started looking for a publisher. And over a period of time, we sent the manuscript off. And they accepted it. And we started going through the editing process, which took several months, didn't it? And finally, it was in print in December of last year, of year before last now. But we haven't done a lot with the book, simply because we've gone through a renovation of a house. Her mom and dad have been very, very ill. Her mom's had a serious stroke, and she's in the rest home now. And we've just had a lot on us the last year, and we haven't had time to do much with the book, so we're just now getting things rolling. The reason I wrote this book was because I wanted to leave something of a legacy for my grandbabies. I didn't write this book necessarily for you, because most of you lived it with me. I wrote this book for my grandbabies. When I look at my grandbabies and I see them, I think, what are they going to know when they get my age? We have, the Parrish family has a distinct history. In the chapter I wrote, 500 years of Parrish history. My son Scott did an extensive research on the Parrish family roots and carried our roots back to 1565. In a small village in eastern England by the name of Kirby. It's on the Bain River in Lincolnshire. And from that point, a man named John Parrish, it all started. And we became very wealthy, our ancestors became very wealthy plantation owners in Barbados. I called Lisa one day, and I said, Lisa, there is a lady who has gotten in touch with me, and she's a black lady, and her name is Parrish. And I said, and we have communicated back and forth, and she shared with me that her ancestry was from Barbados. And our family had several slaves on the plantation. And she was a direct descendant from the slaves that our family owned regretfully back in the 1600s. And that her family migrated from Barbados into Florida. And she was originally from Tallahassee, Florida. But when I look at my grandbabies, and I think, what are they going to know when they get my age? Because all that history is going to be lost. It's not like we stay in one spot anymore. We're all transit. I've lived in Kentucky for over 40 years. My brothers lived in Texas for almost that long. And very few of us who grew up around here stayed here. And if it's that bad now, can you only imagine what's going to be like in 60 more years? So I wanted them to have a history of what it was like for my grandpa to grow up, what it was like to live in the holler, to make a living on poor land dirt, what it was like for my great-grandpa, A.J. Harris. Now, I remember A.J., and I'm sure Wanda does. I remember him, I was 11 years old when he passed away. You know who that is, Jackie?
I sure did.
I'm going to stop right here just for a moment. We went to Jack's one morning for breakfast when I was down here a few, 3 or 4 months ago. And we were walking out, and this old fellow was walking in.
Don't say old fella now.
And Randy said, do you know who that is? And I looked, and I said, Steve Green. So we conversed out in the parking lot there for a little while. And so I gave Steve a book. I wanted him to have it. I told him, I said, Coach, you're mentioned in the book. I wrote about you in the book. And so I gave him a book that morning. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you, sir.
I appreciate you coming.
Yeah.
He's paddled my butt many a time. He has. He used to carry little paddles with a ball on it. He used to carry one in his hip pocket. And when we was practicing basketball at Royal Well, if you missed we called them crip shots. They call them layups today. But if you missed a crip shot, you didn't do anything but stop, bend over, and he busted your butt. It was a swap is a lick every time you missed a layup.
I couldn't get by with that.
No, you couldn't do that now. No, you'd be in jail now.
I'd be in jail.
Coach, you'd be in jail now.
Yeah, I would.
But I wanted my grandbabies to have a legacy of what it was like growing up, a country boy in the rural South in Alabama. I wanted them to have a connection with their Alabama roots. But not only my grandbabies, but your grandbabies as well. Because I want them to know what our family's about and what our family had to endure to get to where we are right now. And what we had to, the sacrifices that they had to make. And those sacrifices are written down in this book. Yes, I remember well Grandma cooking on the wood stove. I remember well hog killing time and skipping school to help Grandpa kill hogs. I remember well. And I wrote the chapter, me and Grandpa was plowing. And I'll never forget that I was out of Grandma and Grandpa's. I was probably 7, 8 years old. And you go to the old house. Remember the old house on the Cove Road? And up behind the house, there was a field that Grandpa was plowing. And I ran up there, and he put me between the plow handles and put my hands on the crossbar. And he hooked the reins, and across that field we went. But I remember that just as clear as it was yesterday. And all of those things just began to flood my mind, and I thought, it's not right. These things need to be written. There needs to be a record of these things. So that's why the book came about. It's not elaborate. There's nothing fancy about it. It's just one man's memoirs, his reflections of a time that I think is better than this time. I think it's much better. Time moves slower. People were happier. And it was just a better time. if you don't mind, I'm going to read you a couple of chapters. And the ones I've selected are, I guess you might say, some of my favorites. I wrote it. All of them's my favorites. But I hope you, if you have read the book, I hope you've enjoyed it. If you haven't read it, I hope you will enjoy it. But one of the chapters I'm going to read to you is them old cotton fields back home. Cotton built the South, and for hundreds of years has been the money crop for farmers big and small. In my youth, there were no big cotton farms like there are today. Most farms were like my grandpa's place, small, poor land farms where you could get by with very little. Most fields were small patches of ground, about 5 or 6 acres in size. When you're plowing ground with a couple of mules, a few acres is all you can handle. I grew up with cotton. My grandpa raised cotton, and we all picked cotton. In my youth, it was just a way of life, and most country boys and girls were in the cotton fields come the fall of the year. Matter of fact, I remember when I was in the 9th, 10th grades, the schools would let out 2 weeks in the fall so the farmers could get their cotton in. And if you lived in the country, you were picking for your family or for someone else. There's an old Johnny Cash song that goes something like this. When them cotton bolls get rotten, you can't pick very much cotton in them old cotton fields back home. And there has never been a truer statement made. The boll weevil is a farmer's worst enemy. Years ago, there were no herbicides and pesticides, and a poor farmer couldn't afford them anyway. So boll weevils had to be picked by hand. I remember when I was a boy of 7 or 8 years old, Grandpa would give us kids a tin can with some coal oil in it and send us to the fields to pick boll weevils off the cotton. He'd give us a penny of boll weevil, and my Uncle Sidney and my Aunt Sandra always made sure I had boll weevils in my can. Just as soon as we got 10 or 15 boll weevils, we'd run back to the house as fast as we could go, or as fast as we could, so Grandpa would give us our pennies. Then we'd beg someone to carry us to Floyd Holder's store so we could buy ice cream and candy. You'd be surprised how much candy 15 cents would buy you in 1956. There really was a thing called penny candy. And a fudge bar was a nickel. I remember once way back yonder, Daddy and some men were hanging out at Floyd's store, and they flipped a quarter to see who was going to buy the Coca-Cola. That quarter bought all 5 men a Coke apiece. And that's right, they were only a nickel, and they were only 6 ounces. When the double cola came out with a 16-ounce drink, Daddy wouldn't let us buy a 16-ounce drink because, as he said, it'll bust your stomach. And you know what? We believed him. Sorry, I hate to chase a rabbit there for a minute. Now back to the subject of cotton. I've heard Daddy say many times that his Aunt Sula Wilkin, my great aunt, and Grandma's sister could pick a bale of cotton a day. That's 480 pounds. Whether that's the truth or not, I don't know, but he told it to be the truth. I would struggle to pick 100 pounds a day. And in 1962, 100 pound of cotton would pay you 75 cents or 70 cents. By the early 60s, Grandpa had gone out of the business of farming full time, so I was picking it for different people after Royal Web School let out and on Saturdays. I remember picking for Hotshot Bonds on one occasion, and he was pretty tight with the purse strings. I remember telling me that when Hot Shot was born, they put him in a quart coffee pot, closed the lid. Now that, dear my friends, is a tall tale, and my daddy was the master of tall tales. I've dragged my share of pig sacks, and they were about 6 foot long with a strap that went over the shoulder. And you always wanted to pick in tall cotton, because picking in low cotton, picking a long row in short cotton would kill your back. I remember the first time I saw a mechanized cotton picker. It was in the Williams community across the road from Old Green Store. The old time farmers didn't like them because they left too much cotton in the field. And at that time they did. Now we're in the age of technology with cell phones and computers and video games have replaced old time work ethic that I learned as an early age in those old cotton fields back home, where I grew up, where I grew as a person on the inside as well as on the outside. When I'm in Alabama driving down the road and I see a new subdivision where I used to pick cotton, I have a sense of sadness because modern times has overtaken the old times, where all my reflections in times were found. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read one more. I'd read these, I'd finish the story, and I'd read it to Marla just to get her viewpoint. And there are a lot of stories I couldn't get through. I'd well up, and before it was over, both of us would be crying. But I remember many times Grandma making old-fashioned country cooking on a wood stove. And I was talking to Sidney the other day, and we were talking about that big pot that hung over the fireplace on the swivel arm where Grandma made cornmeal mush. I want to read you the chapter entitled, Y'all Come On In, It's Supper Time. One morning I stood in my driveway, and this is true, I did. I went out, took a cup of coffee, walked out the garage and stood in the driveway. One morning I stood in my driveway and watched the farmer plant his corn crop in the field across the road. He had a monster of a tractor, and that tractor pulled a 16-row planter, putting a seed in the ground every 6 inches or so. As I watched him, I got tears in my eyes as I traveled back in time, some 60 years ago, to a small cotton farm on the Cove Road, about 10 miles from Jacksonville, Alabama. I could see as clear as the sun shone on that beautiful spring day, my grandpa walking behind a single row planter in brogan shoes and overalls. And that old planter was being pulled by a mule named Mater. My grandpa had walked a many a mile behind a mule planting cotton, hoping for a harvest and praying the boll weevils didn't get it first. At the end of the day, as the sun began to set, he put the planter on the wood skid, hit the reins, and he and old Wager would head to the house. It was supper time. Grandma would have supper ready, and after giving the mules some feed and water, Grandpa would make a slow walk from the barn to the house. It was supper time. Oop, I think I missed a page, excuse me. Grandma didn't have to ring a bell. She just had to say, y'all come on in, it's supper time. I do remember as a small boy walking past the fireplace in the living room and seeing a cast iron pot hanging over a swivel arm, over some hot coals above the fireplace. In that pot was cornmeal mush that Grandma was cooking for supper. Grandpa always had to have meat of some kind at supper time. It didn't matter if it was a rabbit he'd killed or a pork chop from a hog he'd slaughtered the previous fall. But Grandma made sure that there was meat on the table. There was vegetables from the garden and nothing from a can. In the back of the kitchen on the left side stood an old wood cook stove where Grandma would cook some of the best meals I've ever eaten. And have I ever told you, she never burned a thing. Later in years, Grandma learned to cook on a gas stove. She thought that she was in some mighty tall cotton in those days. As a small boy, I recollect, as Grandma would say, going to Uncle Ed and Aunt Beer Bonds' house for supper. They had a long table and had 2 chairs at each end of the table. Along the sides of the table were 2 wooden benches where the young'uns would sit on. Aunt Beer, like Grandma, was a great cook, and of course cooked the old-fashioned country way. It amazes me how those old country women could cook the way they did with what they had to cook with and fix a meal fit for a king. But folks, in order to enjoy that kind of cooking, you had to be from that environment to really appreciate it. In other words, you had to be country. Women like Grandma, who grew up learning from their mothers at an early age how to do with what they had, were women with very little education, but a great deal of knowledge on how to provide for their families. They had to. It was simply the country way. Supper time at Merle Parrish's house was much the same. Was much the same. Mama would put about 2 pounds of butter beans in a three-legged cast iron pot to salt through the day. Now, folks, these were old-fashioned butter beans, and some of them were as big as quarters, and carried about a 106 octane punch to them. And I think you know what I mean. About 2 hours before Daddy got home from work, she'd start cooking them beans with some ham hock or neck bone for seasoning. I've seen Daddy take a 22 rifle, sit on the back porch steps, pitch out some laying mash. That's chicken feed for you city folks. And when the chickens would come close to feed, Daddy would shoot a couple in the head for supper. That way we didn't have to chase them all over the yard. Mama would cut the heads off, making sure to leave the neck. And I'll tell you in a minute, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Then she would dip the chickens in scalding water, get the feathers off, cut them up and fry them in hog lard. Chicken fried off the yard, butter beans, the old-fashioned kind. Mashed taters, mashed with an old-timey tater masher. Put that together with some cornbread, green onions, and a cold glass of sweet milk or sweet iced tea, and you've got yourself a supper that won't quit. Now, why did Mama leave that? Why did Mama leave that neck? Leave the neck on the chicken? She would make sure Daddy got. She'd make sure Daddy got the best pieces. And she would always eat the neck and the wings to make sure Daddy and the rest of us, the rest of the family, got the best parts. I was always amazed how much meat Mama could get off a chicken neck. That was one of the many small sacrifices she made for us as we grew up. Daddy, like Grandpa, had to have some kind of meat at every meal, especially at supper time. And it didn't matter if it was fried chicken or fried bologna, there was always meat on the table. I know that there are people who like them fancy restaurants, and that's all well and good, but give me that old-fashioned country cooking, and I'm in pig heaven. Most of the meals that Marla and I eat today are fixed much like the way Grandma fixed them 60 years ago. And if you look at me, that's obvious. someday soon, I believe the Father is going to say to the Son, Son, tell them to come on in. It's supper time. And Jesus will step out onto the portals of glory and say, come forth. And Mama, Daddy, Grandpa, Grandma, Uncle Borkin, Aunt Benita, and old John Bankhead, with all those who have gone on before us, will come out of the grave, along with all of us who have been washed in the blood of the Lamb, together for the great marriage supper of the Lamb. I've got a feeling that just maybe God has Grandma in the kitchen cooking supper for us. Cooking supper for us all. There's an old song that I remember from my youth entitled, Come Home, It's Supper Time. I do look forward to sitting down around God's supper table in heaven, fellowshipping with my family and all the saints of glory. Supper time is a time to make memories, a precious time to make reflections in time. I hope you enjoy it. I write it better than I read it. I'm sorry. I apologize. If you have a book that you'd like me to sign, I'd be privileged and honored to do it. Also, if you would like to follow us, we've got our own Facebook page. It's just entitled Reflections in Time, and you can like us on Facebook. And you can also, I've written a few stories that are not in the book on the Facebook page. And you can follow us there, also on Twitter. The books are available at any major online bookstore. You can also get it on Kindle. You can get it here at the library at their bookstore. And, it's available just about anywhere you want to send the money into. But, yeah. Does anybody have any questions at all? I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Few more generations, it ain't gonna be supper time no more.
Well, I'm sorry, Rick.
Few more generations, supper times ain't gonna be a word no more.
No.
They gonna
Well,
say
it's
breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Yeah. I said in the book that I didn't know what the word lunch was until I was a grown man. We eat dinner at dinner time.
That's right.
At supper time. And when you come home, when Grandpa would come home from the field at dinner time, he'd eat his dinner. He'd go out and lay out on the front porch and take him just a little nap, and then he'd head on back to the fields. But supper time is long gone. Anybody else have any questions?
I don't have a question, but Mother always said that the good cooking came from Grandmother, that the Paris girls couldn't cook good, but the Hardy girls could. That's what she always said.
Yeah.
Granddaddy's sisters couldn't cook good.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, your mama learned her cooking from her grandma, from her mama. And I've eaten a lot of beans and taters at your mama and daddy's house, I guarantee you. Anyone else?
Well, I just have a comment,
Okay, Jackie.
which Coach Green can verify this. You had a really bad temper.
Yes, I did.
And didn't he, Coach Green?
Yeah.
And I remember one of the times that he fouled the ball and went up there, was called out, called that he'd made a foul. He went up to where the stage was, and it has all these doors at the bottom that you put supplies in. He kicked one of those that I couldn't believe it didn't break, and then he limped out of the room.
Yeah, I remember that distinctly. We had a referee back in those days, and you'll remember, and Coach, I guarantee you'll remember, he had real fuzzy hair, kinky hair, and we called him Teddy Bear. And we was playing at Weaver one night, and he found me out in the first quarter. And it's in the book.
Yeah.
I went in, we dressed in a classroom. I tore that classroom from one end to the other. And next day, had to go back and apologize to the principal, had to go apologize to the teacher. And I'm telling you what, I was humiliated to the end.
Did you tell the people who Hot Shot Bond was?
Yeah, I think I
You
did.
got Hot Shot, but you don't have Clifford.
Huh?
You got Hot Shot, but you don't have Clifford. They probably don't know who Hot Shot is. It's Clifford Bond.
Yeah. Well, see, that's all I ever known him called.
That's the only thing I ever called him.
Yeah, hot shot. Daddy always called it hot shot bun.
We used to pick cotton out there from the store,
That's
that
right.
field there. Elsie, our family, Hot Shot's family, pick cotton. And Elsie, that's Hot Shot's wife, would pick cotton until about 10 o'clock, then she'd have to go home and cook dinner.
Yeah.
And we knew it's dinner time because when she got through cooking dinner, she'd come out there and do this. And when we heard that whistle, let's go eat dinner.
Yeah.
Dinner time.
Yeah.
Elsie was Hot Shot's wife.
I picked cotton out in front of his house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Anybody else got a question?
Was he as mean as Mr. Couch was at Cedar Springs?
No, Coach was good. He was good. He was good. He just bust your butt if you missed first. Yeah, he was good at that. He's a pretty good basketball coach, but he was a good papper too. I'll never forget. We moved from Morgan City down here, and started school Royal Webb in 8th grade. And he saw me, knew I was new. He walked up to me and said, "You play basketball?" I said, "Well, I did for the school I left up in Union Hill." He said, "Why don't you come out and try out?" So I did. And that's where our relationship started. Anything else? Any other comment? I'm so glad that Jackie came. Jackie made up a lot of my reflections in time. And of course, if you read the book, you know about the Holt girls and about old Sarge.
Yeah. That was my mother.
That was her mother.
He would come up to the house and